So we begin with the Vedanta Sutra. We've had our introduction, and let's just jump straight in. First sutra, first adhyaya, first chapter, first pada, first verse, 111. Atato Brahma Jignasa. Now, then, therefore, there is inquiry into Brahman. Here's a typical sutra, 4 words, no verb. It just says ata, now, atas, or ataha, therefore. Now, therefore, Brahma Jignasa. There is inquiry, or just literally inquiry into Brahman, not even a verb there. So the second part's fairly straightforward, not controversial. This text is going to engage in an inquiry into Brahman. That's the topic of this sutra. Each sutra is dedicated to a focus. Okay, the Mimamsa Sutra, Tatta Dharma Jignasa, inquiry into Dharma. The first sutra of the Yoga Sutra, Atta Yoganushasanam. Now there will be the continuation of the teaching of yoga. So straightforward and pronouncement of the subject matter of the sutra. But then the question arises, well, what's the atta, now? Well, what does that refer to? When we say now, well, then the implication is now as opposed to what? As opposed to some other time, as opposed to some other situation. And so a discussion is undertaken. And, as Adam indicates, the now Ramanuja accepts that it's, you do your ritualistic study. You study the earlier portion, the Purva, the earlier Mimamsa, which are the ritualists, the ritualistic portion dealing with Vedic sacrifice. And he accepts you do that, and then you sort of realize its limitedness because it only deals with ephemeral things. And then one, having done that and become purified by doing that, after all they're Vedic texts, then one comes to realize that there must be something deeper, and then one becomes interested in Brahman. Okay, so I'll read you a little bit of Ramanuja. After an inquiry into the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, one comes to know that results acquired by mere sacrifices are ephemeral. So you have to study that first. Typically, we try to find happiness through material means, and it's only when we fail to do that, then we seek a deeper means. That's fairly standard. That seems to be a presupposition of all traditions, even Buddhism, right? Sarvam Dukkam, the spiritual journey begins, or the deeper quest for truth begins when one becomes dissatisfied or frustrated with other types of truths, ephemeral truths, and the pursuit of desire, which never satisfies, always ephemeral, when it's never fulfilled by the pursuit of desire. So, Ramanuja says, after an inquiry into the ritualistic portion of the Vedas, one comes to know that results acquired by mere sacrifices, right? Do sacrifices for the good things in this life, and to attain the celestial realms in the next life. So, one comes to realize they're ephemeral. On the contrary, the results of the knowledge of Brahman is eternal. As such, right, an inquiry into Brahman should be taken up, because the fruits, it's the only thing that can give Brahman and Atman, these deep level truths, are the only things which are eternal, and therefore the only things that will satisfy us. So then Ramanuja sort of presents an opposing point of view. He has this sort of a hypothetical mimamsa, a purva paksha, a respondent, an opponent, saying the mimamsa says, but objects, and mimamsa said, there's no need to know Brahman, the knowledge of which is attained after great effort. You have to do all that tapas and study and control the mind and give up desires. For the results of such knowledge is the attainment of immortality. The opponent says, well, if you seek Brahman, okay, after it's so hard, you have to go through all that arduous austerity, and then you get immortality. But the opponent says, but which can also be had by rituals, as is declared by texts like, and he quotes sort of texts supporting the idea. One text, the text quoted here is, drinking soma, or at the beverage that's offered in the Vedic sacrifice, we have become immortal. This will be some text from some Brahman. And Ramanuja then responds, this is typical, I'm just giving you a couple of examples of this. This is how a sutra exposition proceeds. Right, the opponent's point of view is presented. Whoever is the main opponent at this time, it's Mimamsa and also Sankhya, as we will see in the next verse. So Ramanuja says, the results of work, these ritualistic works, are ephemeral and can never give permanent results. And so it cannot help us attain immortality. Right? And then he quotes his text to respond to the Purvapaksha text, the Mimamsa text. And the text that he quotes is from the Mundaka. Having examined the worlds attainable through works, right? You do your ritual works and you attain which worlds? The celestial worlds. Having examined those, um, a Brahmana should get dispassionate towards them, lose interest. Why? Examine them, and what do you find if you examine the celestial realms? They're temporary. Okay, we should be very familiar with this idea now, that from a Vedantic, yogic, Atman, moksha, from just a generic Buddhist, Jain, moksha point of view, anything that's temporary is unsatisfying and therefore fit to be rejected. One should rather seek the eternal. Okay, so with regards to the Atta then, for Ramanuja, the Atta is having studied, he accepts that you study the Vedas, the Purva Mimamsa, you study them and realize that they are insufficient. Shankara, on the other hand, doesn't take that position. We should probably have read Shankara first, actually, because he's obviously earlier. Although most of the commentators agree with Ramanuja in terms of the Atta, that now, having studied other things and realized their inadequacy, then one comes to the highest truth, which is to be found in the Vedanta, and that's in the Upanishads. Remember, the Vedanta is a clarification of the Upanishads. Shankara says this antecedent, meaning the word now. What is it? What was anteceding that? Because now means now, as opposed to some earlier thing. So this earlier thing, this antecedent, is neither the study of the Vedas. He doesn't accept it, nor the knowledge of and performance of rituals prescribed by the Karma Kanda. He's not accepting it. For these in no way help one who aspires after knowledge. How do they help? Just getting some ephemeral results from some sacrifice. So what does the Atta refer to for Shankara? Certain spiritual requisites. So for Shankara, the now is you have to develop certain spiritual credentials. And what are they? The spiritual requisites referred to are, and I'll give you the Sanskrit, nitya vastu viveka. Viveka. You might want to put remember this word. We're going to encounter it in the Yoga Sutras. Viveka, discrimination. To discriminate between nitya and anitya vastu, things that are eternal, things that are temporary. Nitya is eternal, anitya is not eternal. So to discriminate, what do the Vedic sacrifices give you? Only non-eternal things. So the first requisite for Vedanta study is to realize I'm not interested in non-eternal things or temporary things. I seek the eternal. I seek the ultimate eternal truth. So that's the first prerequisite. Second, iha amutra boga vairagyam, to renounce the enjoyments of fruits, whether in this world or the next world. To lose interest in temporary fruits. It's very similar to the previous one, right? Any kind of enjoyments to be had in this world or the celestial world, where enjoyment is much more sophisticated, much more refined. Senses are more subtle. The senses of the celestial being, they don't have gross bodies. They can't be perceived by gross eyes or instruments. So they're made of subtle matter. And so those who attain the celestial realms have very subtle bodies. But Shankara is saying, to realize to realize that anything temporary does not satisfy, and therefore to renounce them. So renunciation of the enjoyments of fruits, desires. Another way of saying desires. Remember that language because the Gita uses it. The fruits, renunciation of the fruit means if you have a desire for a fruit, for a thing, for some kind of a fruit. Okay, so that's the language of the Gita. So renunciation of the enjoyments of fruits, either this world or the next world. So that's the second one. Third, the six treasures. The six treasures. Okay, and the Sanskrit for that is Samadhamma Sadhana Sampata. So what are the six treasures? Sama, tranquility, to be tranquil in mind. Dhamma is to control the mind. Same thing. If the mind is controlled, it's in some ways it's the same thing. If the mind is controlled, then it's tranquil. Uparati, ceasing any kind of, especially sexual desire, giving up that desires, and understanding that the price tag is really is completely out of proportion with whatever pleasure is involved. So uparati, to give up all kinds of desires. Again, same thing. They're temporary. They don't really satisfy. They're complicated. There's so much price tag is a pretty hefty one from a yogic point of view. 4, titiksha, which is tolerance, to tolerate the pull of the senses, to tolerate the demands of the tongue and the various senses. Someone has to tolerate them. So that's the 4th treasure. And the 5th is shraddha, faith in the path. There has to be faith that there is an Atman, that there is Brahman, that these, and therefore, to stay on the path, one has to have a strong faith that these things are real, they exist, and they're attainable. And finally, and then the 6th one is sanadhana, samadhana, which is keeping the mind fixed on Brahman, on God. So these are the 6 treasures. And for Shankara, then, the utter, what comes before are the cultivation of these 4 prerequisites, right? We just did number 3. Number 3 has 6, the 6 treasures. Okay, what's the 4th? Mumukshatvam, a desire for liberation. That's not like a desire. That's a good desire, right? This not to be confounded with the desires that are supposed to be rejected. What are those desires? Desires for body-mind, for trying to find pleasure through the body-mind. Those are harmful desires from a spiritual point of view, because they pull consciousness back out into the realm of the senses, and then one pursues the objects of the senses, and one makes karma. And then one karma has to be reaction, and that's why we keep coming back. But desire for the Atman is indispensable. There has to be it's not the same category of things. It belongs to a different category than the material desires. Okay? So for Shankara, the 4 requisites are discrimination between permanent and impermanent things, right? Nitya, nitya vastu. Number 2, renunciation of giving up any desire for things either in this realm or the celestial realm, right? So that's iha amutra bhoga, vairagya, big word in yoga, giving up the desire for bhoga, another word that we'll find in yoga, giving up desire for enjoyment, either here or the next realm. That's number 2. Number 3, the 6 treasures. And number 4, the desire for liberation. So these are the prerequisites for Shankara. We'll note that Adams is not very impressed with, read the last line of Adam, our reader, for the Vedanta Sutra. And he's not very impressed with Shankara's 2-tiered theory. So I'll read it, because I think he makes a point. The first thing he says, that there seems to be some kind of difference, right? Because there's an inquiry into Brahman, so there must be an inquirer, so that suggests some kind of difference. Not the monism. The very first verse seems to posit that there is a difference between the inquirer, the active inquiry, and the object of inquiry. So he doesn't say anything about the 2-tiered reality that Shankara promotes. So we'll read what Adams has to say. That some type of difference is implied is difficult to deny. Right? There's a difference between Brahman and the world and the inquirer. This inference is made quite strongly in the commentaries of Ramanuja, Madhva, and lesser known and Vedanta Deshika. He said the other commentators make a big point of this, that there must be a difference between the inquirer and the object of inquiry. Otherwise, there would be no inquiry. There would just be Brahman. There wouldn't be anything else. So, Shankara, let's just keep reading Adam. Shankara attempts to deny this point through his rather clever doctrine of the 2 levels of truth. Remember, conventional and Vyavaharika Paramartika, conventional and ultimate. Leading us to concur with the dualists. Adam is agreeing with the dualists. Oh no, sorry. So I missed a phrase here. Shankara attempts to deny this point through his rather clever doctrine of the 2 levels of truth. But nowhere in the Brahma Sutras is such a doctrine found. There's nowhere in the Brahma Sutra that Badarayana talks of 2 levels of truth, and there's nowhere in the Upanishads. So it is a brilliant doctrine. It's very clever, but it doesn't have any explicit scriptural support. And remember, the Vedantins are all about scripture, not like the logicians that we'll get to later in the semester. They're about logic, not like yoga. Get to next after this. They're about actual experience. Vedanta is all about scriptural interpretation. Okay, so nowhere in the Brahma Sutra is such a doctrine of 2 levels found. Leading us to concur with the dualists, says Adams, right, the author of our text here, Um, whether pure or qualified, whether madhva, whatever kind of dualism, and your introduction should have given you a sense, right? There's the dualism of madhva, a radical dualism. Ramanuja is qualified, non-dualism, right? There's differences within the one, and Vallabha is pure non-dualism, but what he means by that is everything is God, but of course there's differences within God. So we can call them more dualists of some shape or stripe, and Nimbarka as well. So Adams concurs with us, leading us to concur with the dualists, that Badarayana believes that some type of difference exists between the Brahman and the world, because from Brahman comes the world, right? As we'll see in the next sutra. So Sutra number 2. So now we know the Sutra number 1 introduced the text. It's going to be about an inquiry into Brahman. So the next sutra is going to be a definition. Okay, we're going to inquire into Brahman. Established. Now, what's next? Well, what is Brahman? So same with the Yoga Sutra we will find. First verse introduces it, second verse defines it. So what's the definition of Brahman? Janmadyasya yataha. That birth, etc., of this from that. That's literally translated. The birth, etc., of this from that. Fortunately, here all the commentators are in agreement. From that meaning from Brahman, and asya means of this world. So from Brahman comes, and then the birth, etc., means the creation. Birth in the sense of creation, the maintenance and dissolution of this world. So therefore, Brahman is the cause of the reality that we see. Okay, it's an intelligent cause. So everyone is in agreement. As we know, creation in Hinduism is cyclical. So there's birth, maintenance, then dissolution, and then there's a period, and I think it lasts something like 14 billion years. Let me correct that. 4,320,000,000 years is a day of Brahma. So the same again as his night, and you can multiply that by year, and multiply that by days in a year, and multiply that by 100 to get the full trillions of years. That is the cosmic cycle. But I mean, there are many creations within sort of this larger framework of one ultimate creation, maintenance, and dissolution. Within that, there are many ones that seem to last the end of Brahma's day. So that would be every 4,320,000,000 years. There are minor dissolutions and creations. So anyway, but the Brahman doesn't. There's all those figures, you get those from Wikipedia. But the definition of Brahman is that from which creation emerges. Okay, so we'll read some Shankara. So the opponent, so he presents a Purva Paksha. Remember, that's always you start off when you introduce a new sutra. Pretty much every time you're going to introduce the opposing point of view. What's the opposing point of view? The opponent holds that Brahman has no characteristics by which it can be defined. Right? How do you define it? It's not material, so therefore it has no known characteristics. So how can we perceive it or know it or even define it? So that's the opponent's position. It can neither be, so therefore it can't be defined. In the absence of definition, there can be no knowledge. If you can't define it, how can you know it? So then Shankara responds, and first of all he tells us that classic Shankara, that which is the cause of the world is Brahman, where the imagined cause of the world, remember? There is no creation, there is no creator, so it's all imagined, it's illusory. So the imagined cause of the world is indicative of Brahman. So then he gives us two categories. He calls it Tatastha Shakti, which is something that's distinct from something but reveals that thing. So he gives the example of the snake, right? It's actually a rope, we think it's a snake, so our imagined snake actually, but it does reveal that there is a rope behind it, even though the snake itself is imagined. So that's a characteristic which serves to reveal something else. So the creation of the world for Shankara is imaginary, but it serves to reveal, so it is a defining feature, contrary to the opponent. It does have a characteristic by which it can be known, and that characteristic, even though it's imaginary and illusory in a superimposition, right? It's imposed upon, like a mirage of an oasis in the desert. It's imposed upon the desert. It's not real, but nonetheless, that mirage at least reveals there's a desert there. So likewise, as an imagined snake, we see a rope. There's a rope. We imagine it's a snake, a rope on the road. So the snake is imaginary. It's superimposed. But it still reveals there's a snake upon which it rests. So therefore, this creation, which for Shankara is illusory, is nonetheless contrary to the opponent, who's saying that it has no characteristic. It has the characteristic of creation. So accepts that. And then he says that. So that's the characteristic, the tatasta lakshana, a characteristic which is different from the thing but reveals it. But then it has its own characteristics, its actual characteristics, not something different that reveals it, but its own inherent true characteristics. He calls those the svarupa lakshana. And what are they? They would be truth, knowledge, infinity, and he calls the Taittiriya, Satyam, Jnanam, and Anantam. So that the actual characteristics of Brahman that are not superimposed, that Shankara accepts as real, is that it's true, it's Sat, it exists, it continues to always exist, it's conscious, it's Jnana, and it's infinite, Ananta. Okay? So Ramanuja then, connects this verse with the Upanishads. So, and he quotes the Taittiriya, which is a short, but actually has a lot of verses that are of great interest to the Vedanta tradition. I just got, sorry, my neighbor just came in. I'm not sure where I was. So Ramanuja quotes the Taittiriya, which is often quoted by Vedanta. It's short, but it's got a lot in it. And he wants to support this idea that, after all, the Vedanta Sutra can't just come up with a definition of Brahman on its own. Remember, the Vedanta Sutra. By the way, are we clear? It has three names: Vedanta Sutra, Brahma Sutra, and Uttaramimamsa. I trust I've made that point before. I'm using the term Vedanta Sutra. Sometimes the text will call it the Uttaramimamsa, but it's also known as the Brahma Sutra. And in fact, Adam's book is called Badarayana's Brahma Sutra. So hopefully you're not confused. Three different names. Okay, Vedanta Sutra, Brahma Sutra, because it's about Brahman, and Uttaramimamsa, the later or higher inquiry. So he quotes the Upanishads, all right, because he can't just make up his own definition. Badarayana can't make up his own definition of what Brahman is. He's, after all, an exegete of the Upanishads. He's explaining the Upanishads. So the Taittiriya says, that from which these beings are born, by which they live after birth, and into which they enter at death, try to know that. That is Brahman. So that's exactly what this sutra is. Janmadi, the birth, etc. What's etc? Maintenance and dissolution. Okay, so all commentators pretty much in agreement there. Madhva adds a little bit to, for him, there's not just the janma, the birth, etc. It's not just birth, maintenance, dissolution. He adds some other categories, but more or less in agreement. And again, Adams takes the opportunity here to express his dissatisfaction with Shankara's two-tiered position, an Advaita position. So if we look at Adams on page, let's have a look, page 41, about two-thirds through, it is logical to assume that he considered it to be an essential definition. That definition of Brahman is that from which the creation emerges. It would hardly make sense, for instance, to present a secondary, unimportant definition of the Brahman at this early point in the work, although Shankar tends to advocate this very position, arguing that Brahman's creatorship is an accidental quality, what we just said, the lakshana, the tatasta lakshana. What's Adam saying? He's saying, look, at the very beginning you're defining something. Why would you be defining it if it was actually unreal? If creation was unreal, why would you be defining Brahman as that from which creation comes? If creation is ultimately unreal, it doesn't make much sense. The opening of your sutra, right, you announce what it is. First sutra, Tattva Brahma Jignasu. Second sutra, you define it. Why would you be defining it if it was unreal? And were that the case, you would say so. So he's not impressed with Shankara's, attempts to sort of argue that it is a secondary definition. That like the snake, which is illusory, is, it reveals the rope, but there's no grounds to suppose Badarayana had that in mind. At least he doesn't indicate that. So therefore, top of page 42, Badarayana perceives God or Brahman in some manner different, right? Different from the world. So there's Brahman, and from it comes this creation. So that would suggest that there is some difference there. Um, so you can read page 42. We're right in the middle. So we get the sense that he likes some of Shankara's interpretations, but he's not impressed with his two-tiered theory, simply because Badarayana never explicitly or even implicitly suggests it. Neither do the Upanishads. At best, the Upanishads, you can argue implicitly, one or two verses might point to that, but there's nowhere explicitly where it's stated there's two tiers of reality. So in the middle of page 42, Adams points out, while Shankara may describe this position with considerable eloquence, Shankara is a brilliant theologian, and defend it with some impressive theologizing, he offers no, and here's the point, he offers no evidence to demonstrate that this is also Badarayana's position, that there is this two. Badarayana, in fact, makes no mention of two levels of truth. Therefore, it is logical to assume that the statements made by him are made in a straightforward manner. Why would we, 500 odd sutras, hundreds of sutras, why would we imagine, and nowhere does he say, oh, by the way, there's this two level of truth that we should be processing the Upanishads through. And the Upanishads also, one could argue, did not suggest that. If Badarayana states that Brahman is the creator of the world, we must assume that he means just that. He provides no reason for assuming that he means something different from what he actually says, right? For Shankara, Badarayana, what he really means is that it's an illusory creation. But of course, Badarayana himself is not saying that, right? So then, a bit further down, Adam says, and in the first two sutras, when we look at them together, we are led to an even stronger sense of Badarayana's belief in some type of difference between the Brahman and the world. Okay, we say this because, first of all, two consecutive sutras imply some type of difference. So that's the first. We'll move the first two sutras. We'll now move on to the and the other point that Adams makes at the top of 43 is not only is he implying some kind of difference between Brahman and the world, but he's a realist. There's no indication the world is not real. What is Brahman is that from which this world, etc., comes. There's no indication at all that world is unreal. So, moving on to Sutra number 3. Actually, before we do that, let's read some Shankara. It's very interesting Shankara here on the second sutra, before we move on to the third. So for Shankara, then, scripture is what reveals, so all the Vedantins accept that ultimately, we'll find that out next sutra, that the scripture reveals Brahman. But, that reasoning can be used to support the scriptures. Such reasoning must be corroborative of the truth inculcated, right? It corroborates it. So we apply reason to defend or to support the revelations of scripture. And now this is important for Shankara. This kind of reasoning includes the hearing. So first of all, we hear the text, and everybody accepts this. We have to first hear them, right? Or in our case, we read them because we have the printing press. But prior to the printing press, you'd be hearing anywhere in the world, you'd be hearing the teaching. So Shravana begins with Shravana. Then thinking about their meaning, Manana. So that would be, we apply logic to them, we engage them with reason and argument. That would be the second. First hear about it, then we engage with them with logic. And then we meditate on them, nididhyasana. We meditate on the truths. We begin to see how reality, that desire is temporary. We begin to, if someone gives us that lens to look at desire through, with which to look at desire, then we begin to see, that's true. Desires, they don't really satisfy, and they are temporary. And I wish I could make those Kodak moments last forever, but they don't. So we apply them in our actual in our day-to-day life, and we begin to perceive that they're true. So then eventually comes meditation, samadhi, and meditating on them, nididhyasana. We meditate on them, and then this leads to samadhi. So by samadhi is meant a vritti, a state of mind. Now keep this word in mind. Yoga Sutra it's all going to be about vrittis. It's going to be one of our vocab terms. You want to write it down now? Go ahead. Vritti. So by samadhi is the vritti of the mind, which destroys ignorance about Brahman. So actually, Brahman is always there. Knowledge doesn't reveal Brahman. Knowledge removes ignorance. Very important for Shankara. All this work of studying the scripture, contemplating the scripture, applying logic to it, all of that creates a certain vritti or state of mind. What does that do? It removes ignorance. When ignorance is removed, then Brahman that was always there reveals itself. It's like the mirage, right? You think there's an oasis there, and then you apply logic and reasoning and all of that to say, no, they can't be, it's not on my map, then I don't see that. And you apply all of this, and then all of a sudden, that knowledge causes the mirage to be dispelled, and then you see what was really there is just sand or whatever. So likewise, that's a rough. Actually, it's an analogy that Shankara himself uses of the mirage. So in the same way, logic and reasoning doesn't reveal Brahman. Brahman is already there, but it removes the ignorance. So let's see how he frames that. So all of that creates a vritti of the mind, in samadhi, a vritti of the mind, a state of mind which destroys our ignorance about Brahman. When the ignorance is destroyed by this mental modification, this new developed mind, this purified mind, purified through hearing and reflecting and contemplating the truths and concentrating on the truths, when this is destroyed, so Brahman, when the ignorance is destroyed, sorry, I skipped a line. This mental modification of the mind destroys our ignorance about Brahman. And when the ignorance is destroyed by this mental modification, this sort of cultivated mindset, in the form of Brahman, it's called a Brahmakara vritti, a certain kind of mind which connected to, has the form of Brahman, literally, a vritti which has the form of Brahman. When that appears in the mind, Brahman, which is self-luminous, reveals itself. Ignorance is dispelled. It's like you remove the cloud, and then the sun is there. It was always there. So that's the purpose of Vedanta for Shankara. It reveals itself. For Ramanuja, of course, Brahman is a person, and he can only be known through devotion. Only reveals himself through devotion, not through knowledge. Big difference between Ramanuja and Shankara. In ordinary perception, I'm just going to read this because we're going to get it again in the Yoga Sutras. Next week. In ordinary perception, right, we perceive something, we cognize an object, the mind takes the form of the external object. So I'm looking at a table, my mind now has an impression of the table, and consciousness becomes aware of it. Consciousness shines on the mind. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get to yoga. So it takes the mind takes the form of the external objects, which destroys the ignorance about it. And consciousness, reflected in this modification of the mind, manifests the object. Okay, so object is reflected in the mind, right, accurately. The mind, the consciousness is absorbed in the mind because it's distinct from the mind, and it becomes aware of that object. In the case of Brahman, however, right, how does it work with Brahman? That's how it works with a regular object, right? It sees something, mind takes the form of that object, and I, the conscious entity, become aware of that object as reflected in the mind. That's cognition in yoga psychology, and we'll talk more about it. How does it work for Brahman? In the case of Brahman, however, the mental modification, the change in the mind, destroys the ignorance. Doesn't reveal Brahman. You can't. How can the mind can't reveal Brahman? Brahman is a different type of thing. The mind can only reveal material objects. It only has sway over material objects. In the case of Brahman, however, the mental modification destroys the ignorance. But Brahman, which is consciousness pure and simple, manifests itself, being self-luminous. Nothing can reveal it. All that we can do is remove the barriers, right? Just like removing the barriers, opening the window, letting the sun shine through. So that is why the scriptures describe Brahman as not this, not this, not iti, not iti, it's not this, not this, not this, not this. We have to remove all the ignorance for Shankara, and Brahman shines through. Okay, so that's very classic Shankara. So sutra number 3, Shastra Yonitvat, that literally, again, 2 words, Shastra and Yonitvat. Yoni is the womb, and so Yonitvat from the source, or its source is Shastra. So the commentators pretty much agree, although Shankara gives an alternative explanation. they agree that this means that how do we know about Brahman? Okay, so first sutra announces that, okay, now we're going to study Brahman. The second gives us definition. Brahman is that from which the creation, etc., emerge. The third sutra is, how do we know all that? From scripture. Shankara suggests another interpretation, which is from Brahman comes scripture, which is actually true, but we won't focus on that because for most of the commentators then, the main point of Sutra 3 is actually the first translation, that it is known, its source is scripture. Okay? So, let's read Ramanuja actually here, because Shankara engages in a sort of, he's engaging with Mimamsa. It's a couple of centuries earlier. The Mimamsa was still stronger at the time of Shankara, and the Mimamsas want to say, what's the point of these just describing Brahman is useless. The scripture should be about prescription, not description. They just prescribe action, and therefore the Mimamsas want to act in the world. What is dharma? Do your rituals. So their focus for them. Scripture is only meaningful if it tells us what to do. Otherwise, what's the point of having scripture? It has to be prescriptive. So Shankara is engaging with them and disagrees with them in various ways, but perhaps we'll just read one little statement that he makes, and that is, just give me a second. Actually, he makes that statement at the next sutra, so we'll keep that for then. And he doesn't, so we'll just read Ramanuja here. I think that will suffice, because Shankara doesn't say very much in his commentary at this point. He saves it for the next sutra. So, Ramanuja. So he first introduces the Purva Paksha, opposing point of view. So the opponent says, the scriptures give us knowledge only of those things that cannot be known otherwise, right? So the opponent says, look, what's the point? The only use of scripture is to reveal things that we can't know in any other way, right? If we can see them or infer them or reason as to their existence, then what do we need scripture for? So scripture is only useful for revealing things that cannot be known through any other epistemology, any other way of knowing. So, if Brahman could be known only from the scriptures and not from other sources, then the scriptures would be proof of Brahman. And the Taittiriya text that we quoted a minute ago or earlier in the lecture, then that Taittiriya text cited in the last sutra could be taken as a definition of Brahman. So the opponent's saying, well, if Brahman could not be known by any other means, then, okay, the scripture has value in terms of Brahman. But the scriptures are not the only source of knowing Brahman, says the opponent, as it could be known through other proofs, such as inference. You could make an inference that the world is created or it has parts, and anything that has parts, somebody must put the parts together. So therefore there must be like a pot. So a pot has halves that are put together, and therefore there must be you can infer the existence of a potter. So later on in the semester we'll look at the inferential arguments for God's existence by Nyaya. And they were basically intelligent design of our day and age. That the fine-tuning argument is how it, which is a modern sort of version of that. That the universe is so incredibly fine-tuned that had anything, it had, even gravity, the force of gravity, or electromagnetic force, or the nuclear forces, had they been even sort of 0.0, a fraction different, even one of the many forces that have been a fraction different, there would have been no creation. So there's no way that could come about by chance. So the inferential argument is the world is such a sort of masterpiece of design, and how did the atoms and forces come together and to produce this universe in all known instances, right? You make an inference based on known instances, and all known instances, things which are product of parts, have been put together by a creator. So we'll see those arguments later on. So the opponent is saying we don't need the scripture. We can use inference to establish that there must be a first cause, an intelligent cause. So this world, being made up of parts, is an effect. Anything which is made up of is made up of parts is an effect. It's been put together, and one can easily infer that an effect like this, which is so varied and wonderful, says the opponent, must have a creator who is omniscient and all-knowing. How else can you explain the variegatedness and just the sort of marvels of the world? Unlike ordinary souls, which are of limited power and knowledge, right? The creator must be omniscient. not like us. We can only make little things like pots and pans and maybe spaceships, and but we can't create a universe. So the scriptures not being the only means of knowing Brahman, continues the opponent. They can't be proof of Brahman. What's the point of having the scripture? We can infer there must be a creator. And so this Taittiriya verse cannot be accepted as defining Brahman, says the opponent. Answer. Now Ramanuja steps in. This objection cannot be accepted. Though he concedes, it's true, we can infer a creator, yet it is not known that the entire world, well, we can know there's a creator, but that's all we can know. It is not known that the entire world was created at one time and by one being. We don't know. Okay, given that the inference establishes there's a creator, but we don't know there was only one creator. What if there was two or more than two? And how do we know it was created at one time and not in successive periods, right? So it is quite possible that different parts were created at different times, says Ramanuja. So we don't know. We only know vaguely that there must be an intelligent creator. We know nothing about it. So Ramanuja wants to say we must have scripture. Otherwise we only get a very, very basic, vague inference that there's some kind of creator. What if there's many? What if it's a malevolent being? What if it's a demon, like Descartes pondered? So it may have been created by many individual souls, which are known to acquire extraordinary powers by yogic practice, right? You do yoga, as we'll find out in Patanjali, get all kind of mystic powers. So what if a bunch of yogis got together and created the world? Therefore, the existence of a single transcendent being cannot be inferred. We can't infer that there's only one being that created it at one time, and a benevolent being and an intelligent being. We can't infer that. We can only infer that it must have, well, we can infer it must have an intelligent cause, but it could be two beings and many beings and created across time. Okay, and so therefore we need scripture, and therefore sutra number 3 is, how do we know about Brahman? We know about it through scripture. Reasoning can just take us very generally to some basic argument that there must be some kind of initial prime mover or some primeval intelligence, but nothing more than that. The nature of that being can only be revealed. So that's sutra number 3. So verse number 4. Tat tu samanvayat. But that scripture, that, literally, but that because of order. That's all the sutra says. But that because of order. So the commentators agree here that it means that there's a hypothetical objector here, the Purva Paksha, and that's the but. And the Purva Paksha is saying something like, well, okay, you're saying that scripture is the only way of really knowing Brahman. Through inference, we can maybe infer there's an intelligence, but nothing more than that. So Brahman actually reveals the true nature of that cause of creation, the ultimate cause. But the scripture's unsystematic, right? An academic scholar certainly would look at it that way. Would see, in some places, Brahman appears to be a personal being, and other places impersonal. Some places, like the rivers going into the ocean, seems like the Atman is merging into Brahman, and other places seems distinct. So the accusation, the Purva Paksha, the objection is, well, this scripture is not much good, even if it's true that that Brahman has to be revealed, that the ultimate cause has to reveal itself. Otherwise, we can only make a very vague inference. Even if that's true, and if you say, well, this, it's revealed in scripture, but the scriptures are inconsistent. So this verse counters that. No. It says it is samanvayat, there is regular order or succession. And this is the position of the Vedanta tradition, that there isn't, actually the sutras are not unsystematic. They appear to be, if they appear to be unsystematic, it's because we're not reading them through a proper lens. So, scripture is perfect, it's eternal, or it's revealed by Ishvara, by the Vedantins, or Mimamsa, it's eternal. It can't be inconsistent, it's divine revelation. So therefore we need to learn how to read it properly, and that's the Vedanta position. Of course, the problem is that the lenses that the commentators apply are very different. So as we've said numerous times, for Shankara, the places in the Upanishads where it seems to speak of a real world and a personal God and real individual souls, that's conventional reality. And the other places in the Upanishads where it appears that Brahman is impersonal and beyond form, and the soul merges into Brahman, then those are ultimate reality. That's his lens. He has a two-tiered way of filtering the different statements. They either belong to the conventional lower category or the ultimate category. So that way he can, because you can't reject any statements in the Upanishads. Divine revelation, you have to take them all. Ramanuja's model, on the other hand, is God and with his body. The body has two modes: the world and the souls. And so for those references where which speak of a real world, well, that's because there is a real world. And those that speak of a real soul, that's because there is a real soul. And those that speak of God as a person, well, that's because God is a person. Now, when the statements that appear to suggest that Brahman is impersonal, for Ramanuja would say something like, well, he doesn't have material qualities. That doesn't mean he doesn't have transcendent qualities. So when Brahman is described as nirguna, without qualities, then Ramanuja would say, well, that simply means he doesn't have material qualities. And where the verses which suggest that the soul is merging into Brahman, for Ramanuja would say something like, well, they unite with God in love and devotion, but that doesn't mean that the soul literally merges and loses its individuality. So they have their way, brilliant ways. They're brilliant theologians. They have their way of accounting for these different kinds of statements. So for them, Sutra number 2, Tattu Samanvayat. Scripture is consistent. You just need to know, and that's the job of the exegete. That's Shankara considers that to be his task, to give us a lens through which to read these, to make these Upanishads systematic and consistent, to construe consistency from them, and of course that lens remains in his Advaita Vedanta lineage. These are lineages that have been around for 1,200 years at least. And Ramanuja has his lineage, and you can tell that from the sacred clay that indicates the different lineages of some of these Vedantins. Ramanujas would be white with red in the middle, going up like this. These are the theists, believe in a personal God. And Shankars would be 3 lines going across like that. Okay, so and we'll just quickly mention Madhva here, because Madhva has an interesting way. And we're only reading the first 5 verses in this course. But you'll see later on, even in the very first pada of the first chapter, the first section, the Vedantins have to deal with statements in the Upanishads that say things like, well, prana, life air, is the source of everything. Or elsewhere, the golden person in the sun is the source of everything. And elsewhere again, space is the source of everything. So there are statements which seem to suggest that reality as we know it springs from things other than Brahman, right? So Vedantins have to say no. They have to find ways of arguing. No, those are really secondary references. They're metaphoric references. Okay, so Madhva has an interesting way of pitching this. He says there's 3 kinds of statements. One is, and this is Adams, page 46, Anyatra Prasiddha. And these are words which commonly refer to something other than Brahman, maybe like the life air or, space or something, but which could refer to Brahman through their secondary meaning. Secondary, not literal meaning. Literal meaning, it says life air, it says space. It's from space that all these creatures arise. Verses like that all over the Upanishads. But that's the secondary. This space is actually a secondary reference to Brahman. So that's Anyatra Prasiddha, that's the first kind. Words that normally refer to something else. The second kind, Ubhayatra Prasiddha. Words that could refer either to Brahman or something else, perhaps something like the eternal. It is the eternal that you should seek, my son. And I'm just guessing that. But words that could refer either to Brahman or to something else. And finally, Anyatra Eva Prasiddha. Words which are commonly understood to refer solely to something other than Brahman. There are words that normally, in their normal uses, never refer to Brahman. They refer to things other than Brahman. Vedantins have to somehow argue that actually they're referring to Brahman in some secondary sort of way. So that's the job of the Vedantin, especially in the first chapter. The first chapter of the 4 chapters of the Vedanta Sutra sets out to argue, to sort of deal with these recalcitrant statements, these statements that appear to challenge the Vedantin position that Brahman, the definition of Brahman, Sutra number 2, Janmadhyasya Yataha, that creation, maintenance, and dissolution emanates from it. There's plenty of verses in the Upanishads that say that, by the way. There are sufficient verses, and we quoted one, I think, earlier in the lecture, that do say that, it's from Brahman that all these beings spring. But there are also these other verses that seem to suggest space. Everything comes from space, or everything comes from the life air, or everything comes from the golden person in the sun. So they have to somehow find ways to argue, no, those are really references to Brahman. The other thing they have to deal with is whether references are to the Atman or to Brahman. That's another topic that gets worked throughout the Vedanta Sutras. Okay, so that's Sutra number 4, and we'll move on to Sutra number 5. So Sutra number 5 is an interesting sutra because it'll give us a window into how it's quite possible to construe completely different interpretations from a sutra. All it says is Ikshater na ashabdam. Because of thinking, no, not mentioned. That's it. Ashabdam. It is not. There's no word there's no word corresponding to it. Now, it is not mentioned. It's not spoken of. That would be better. So ikshater, because of thinking, no, because it's not mentioned. Now, what does that mean? Badarayan never tells us. So ikshater is the reference in the Upanishads. It's referring to a verse in the Upanishad, but Badarayan doesn't tell us which verse it is. Okay, these sutras would have been handed down, or through teacher and student, and it would have been handed down in lineages, and the teacher would have then known what the reference was. So the commentators have to first of all find out, well, where in the Upanishads does it say ikshater, because of thinking? How does that relate to the discussion so far? First four sutras, right, discuss Brahman. It's the origin of the creation, and the scriptures are consistent. And what is this a reference to? And so Shankara and Ramanuja agree here, and they take it that the na is actually referring to Sankhya, and Sankhya says that the source of creation is not an intelligent being, but just matter itself, prakriti, pradhana. So they take the na as, even though the sutra doesn't say that at all, they are. That's their interpretation of the na. Who's the na referring to? Not. It's definitely a purva paksha, an opposing point of view. They take it as Sankhya. So Sankhya says, no, Brahman is not the source of the creation. It's just prakriti, matter itself. We don't need to. And so they take this to mean na. No, it is not prakriti. The na, and then square brackets, right? Because we're inserting this. When you insert something into translation, when you're translating something, and you add something that's not in the actual translation, if you're a translator, you put it in square brackets. That indicates that you, the translator, have to add that. Otherwise, the translation will be unreadable. So no, it does not. Prakriti is not the source of creation, right? Because it's not mentioned, and there is a reference to thinking. Ikshater. There's a reference to thinking in the Upanishads. So therefore, it's thinking. It can't be matter. Matter doesn't think, and therefore the source of translation, the source of creation, must be a thinking entity. Okay, so that's how they take Sutra number 5. That because of this reference to thinking, no, it's not the matter that proposed by some Sankhya traditions, because that is. That is not, that matter isn't, scripture doesn't support that. Ashabdam, it's not mentioned in scripture. So that would be Shankara and Ramanuja, and then we'll get to Madhava in a minute. Let's just read. Now this topic goes on for right up until Sutra number 11. So we've got 5 till 11. So that means 6 sutras. Okay, it's one topic, and the topic is Ikshater. Intelligibility is how Adams translates it, intelligence. That source is intelligence. So then we get to Sutra number 6. So now there's the Sankhya, according to Shankara Ramanuja. None of this is in the Sutra. The Sutra just says, Gunas chet na atmashabdat. That the secondary, if secondary meaning, no, the word Atman. That's all the sutra says. So Shankara and Ramanuja take that to mean, to indicate that the Sankhya comes back now. responds, okay, previous sutra, sutra number 5 said, no, the scriptures say it's intelligent. So it can't be Prakriti. And Sankhya then says, according to Shankara and Ramanuja's reading, well, this intelligence is to be understood in a secondary sense, not a primary sense. Remember, the Vedantins, they do a lot of this application of secondary meanings to things. So now the Sankhya is doing it, saying, no, that intelligence is just a secondary. It doesn't really mean it's intelligence. And then their response is, no, that can't be true. This counter response can't be true. Why? Because the word Atman is referred to in that passage. And it is. So about a few verses on from there, we have the reference to Atman, and all those verses that you're familiar with of the rivers Sa Atma Tattvamasi, probably the most quoted verses in the Upanishads. That Atman Tattvamasi, you are that. And so therefore, if it's an Atman, it can't be Prakriti, because Atman is a conscious entity, and Sankhya would accept that too. Okay, so they're refuting now the Sankhya counter response, that in Sutra number 5, the fact that there's a reference to intelligence, Sankhya wants to take that as a secondary, not primary meaning, and so on. So we have, and this goes on, Sutra number 7 saying that, and besides that, Tannishtasya moksha upadesha, because of the teachings of liberation for one who's devoted to it. So Vedanta says, so in the same passage, right, it's taught that moksha comes if one is devoted to that intelligence, to that Brahman. And no one is devoted to Prakriti. Even the Sankhya themselves say you have to renounce Prakriti. So then, so that's Sutra number 7. So it can't be Prakriti that's being referred to, because one is supposed to devote oneself to it, and from that devotion to this intelligent entity, one gains liberation. So it can't be Prakriti, because no one devotes themselves to Prakriti. Not even Sankhya would say that. They would say you know the opposite. You'd have to sort of renounce Prakriti. And then there's another statement, Sutra number 5, Heya Tvat Vachanat. And because of the statement that it is to be renounced, I'm sorry, there's no statement that it is to be renounced. If it had been Prakriti, there would have been a statement that one should renounce it. But actually, there's no such statement. That's Sutra number 8, and we won't worry about Sutra number 9. It's just a bit esoteric, and we won't get much mileage out of it. And 10 says, and all the teaching, Gati Samanyat, all the teachings are uniform in this regard. Right, the whole Upanishads all say that Brahman is the source of everything. Shruta Tvachcha, and so does the Shruti. So the teachers are all uniform, and so are the Upanishads themselves. So the Badarayana concludes it by saying all the scriptures say Brahman is the source. So we don't need to. In other words, okay, conversation over. The objection is useless. It's invalid. All the scriptures, everybody knows that the scriptures say Brahman is the source of everything. Okay, so putting all that together, Shankara, the main point to take away from this, don't worry about too much about Sutras 6, 7, 8, and 9. It's really Sutra number 5 that we're interested in, and that is that it is intelligent. That Brahman is intelligent, and therefore, according to Shankara and Ramanuja, it cannot refer to the Prakriti of the Sankhya, because some Sankhya traditions did not posit an intelligence. They just said there was Purusha and Prakriti. When the two came together, then creation emerged. Of course, Vedanta's going to say, well, how do they come together in the first place, right? But Purusha, before it's embodied, is just pure consciousness. It doesn't have any will or mind or intelligence. It's just pure consciousness. And Prakriti is inanimate. So how do the two come together? There has to be an intelligence that brings them together. But anyway, there were some theistic Sankhya traditions that would have accepted the Vedanta position that there was Brahman, that was an intelligent entity behind as the source of creation, and then there would have been, there definitely were non-theistic Sankhya traditions, because the Vedanta Sutra seems quite concerned with rebutting those traditions that did not accept intelligence. So Ikshater. So this is kind of intelligent design. The term in Sanskrit here is Ikshater. Okay, so let's see how Madhava finds very different verses. Let me just see how to find the stop button. Excuse me. Shankara translates it completely differently. Okay, so again, Shankara and Ramanuja translate these four words, ikshater na, three words, ikshater na ashabdam, that na, no, it is not, no, it just says no, but they say no, it is not the prakriti of the Sankhya tradition, ashabdam, because it's not mentioned in the scripture, ikshater, and because of the reference in the scripture, rather, to an intelligent being. Madhava translated it as that na ashabdam, that Brahman is not ashabdam, not inexpressible. Ikshater, because it can be perceived. So here Madhava has a different kind of opponent in mind. The opponent is saying, okay, it's all very well. Let's say there's Brahman. But really we can't know Brahman because we can only know material things. Our mind and senses are only equipped to understand and know things that are in the purview of our senses, that are accessible to sense perception, and from which our mind can conceptualize and make inferences and deduce things. But Brahman is beyond sense perception, and therefore there's nothing we can deduce, so it's inexpressible. So the ashabdam for Madhva means it's inexpressible. And the na for him is, no, it's not inexpressible. And why? Ikshater, because it can be known. And so the Ikshater, right, which is a reference to, the Ikshater is Badarayan's reference to a verse in the Upanishads. And the rest of it is Badarayana saying, well, and depending on Shankara or Madhva, he's saying quite different things. But the Ikshater is a reference to the Upanishad. Shankara and Ramanuja take that reference to be the Chandogya verse we just read. But Madhva on page 50, he takes this as a reference to 5 different verses, and starting with the Prashna Upanishad, which does mention the word Ikshater also, and it says, he beholds the fort-dwelling person. The way Adams is translated, he, the seeker, perceives the Supreme One through initiation by the exalted Brahman. Right, the actual text adds more to that, but we'll go with Adams. So what is the point? The point is that the Atman can be perceived, Brahman can be perceived, and Madhava wants to draw attention to that it is knowable, it can be perceived, right? The opponent's saying, okay, fine, let there be a Brahman, but how do we know it? We can't perceive it. And Madhava is saying, no, it can be perceived. Ikshater, for him, refers to the possibility of its being perceived. And then so he quotes the Prashna saying, it can be perceived. And then he quotes the Brihadaranyaka saying, he should perceive. Again, the word perceive. It's not always ikshater, sometimes it's pashyati. Doesn't matter about that. And again, another verse, number 3 from the Brihad Aranyaka, he shall endeavor to obtain direct vision. So the claim has always been made, and we get to the Yoga Sutras next, which is all about how do we get an actual vision, how do we perceive the Atman. But at this point, Madhava wants to say that Brahman is knowable. Otherwise, what's the whole point in writing, 500 odd sutras if it's unknowable? So he wants to say, no, it's knowable. How do we know and how do we know that? Well, the scriptures themselves say so. And remember, this is all about interpreting the scriptures. Okay, so there we have an example. It shows the challenge of sutra translation. We only have 3 words, no verbs. All it says is because of perception, no, not mentioned. Ashabdam can mean not mentioned, but it can also mean what Madhava wants it to mean, inexpressible. It can't be mentioned because it's inexpressible. The word Ashabdam can be translated in different ways. Okay, so one more time. So Shankara and Ramanuja, for them, the Purva Paksha is the Sankhya school, which is saying, no, Prakriti, inanimate, material Prakriti is the cause of creation. We don't need to posit an intelligent being. So they're going to say the na means no to that Purva Paksha, the Sankhya proposal of Prakriti, no. And why? Ashabdam, because it's non-scriptural, it's not mentioned in the scripture, and Ikshater, because of the reference to perception. So there then, they are refuting a Sankhya Purvapaksha. Madhva is refuting, in his mind, he reads it completely differently. Who can say who's right or wrong? Badarayana has only given us 3 cryptic sutras, so we're completely dependent on the commentaries, which would be fine, but the commentaries completely differ from each other, not just in the interpretation of the sutras, but we've seen in their whole ontology. They completely differ. But let's just finish up. So Madhva, he takes the Purvapaksha to be an opponent who says, okay, let there be Brahman, but it could never be known, so it's useless talking about it. It can never be known, it's beyond sense perception. It's like a scientist trying to talk about what came before Big Bang. It's beyond the purview of science. Well, what you can only speculate or believe, or take some faith position. So the opponent is saying, well, it can never be known. If there is this intelligent cause of creation, it can never be known. And then Madhva wants to refute that by saying, nah, ashabdam, for him, it's not ashabdam. No, it's not the fact that it is unknowable or inexpressible. Ashabdam is inexpressible. Can mean inexpressible, can also mean it has not been mentioned. No, it is not inexpressible. Why? Because there's reference in the Upanishads to ikshate, that it can be perceived. Okay, so 2 very different exegesis. And this is the entire Vedanta tradition. It's not really philosophy. It's more like scriptural. It's hermeneutics and exegesis. So, the project then of the Vedanta tradition, we have the Upanishads. They appear to be unsystematic. Let's wrap it all up. We're moving on to yoga next week. They appear to be systematic, say different things in different places. So along comes Badarayana. At that point, probably the Upanishadic tradition was under challenge from people, rejecting the Vedic authority of the Vedic texts. Internally, too, there is a difference between the Mimamsas, who want to focus on ritual, and the Vedantins, who want to focus on the quest for Brahman. And they're both accepting the Vedic text. So there's an internal friction and debate as to what is the real purport of the Vedic corpus. Is it to tell us how to act in the world and how to perform rituals as the Mimamsas want it to be, or is it about seeking a higher truth as the Vedanta wants it to be? So there's an internal debate and division and friction. Then there's people outside the fold that are saying different things. And for example, Sankhya is saying, well, we don't accept this Brahman. We think that it's just Purusha and Prakriti. We don't need to posit an intelligent cause. Let there just be Prakriti. So Shankara and Ramanuja then are already at this point engaging or rejecting Sankhya. And then Adams seems to favor Madhva in this, between Madhva and Shankara and Ramanuja, in terms of the interpretation of 1.5 to 1.11. This is topic number 5 of Ikshate, intelligibility. He favors Madhva. He says, why are they suddenly, critiquing Sankhya now when they're actually going to critique Sankhya at the end of the first chapter and at the beginning of the second chapter? So why would they just randomly have this section here now? He doesn't feel it really follows very well. Adam seems to think Madhva's is better because, the first verse introduced, Atato Brahma Jignasu, now we're going to talk about Brahman. The second verse defines it, Janmadhyasya Yataha, Brahman is that from which creation and maintenance emerge. And then the third verse is, and then the third sutra is Shastra Yonitvat, and it is known from Shastra. How do we know about it, right? So we're all saying Brahman is the source of creation. How do we know about it? We know about it from Shastra. And then the fourth sutra is, and Shastra is consistent, right? Because, okay, maybe it can be known from Shastra, but the opponent can say the Upanishads don't do a very good job of being consistent. So Badarayana says, actually, they are consistent. You just need to know how to read the scriptures. And then Adams thinks that Madhva's interpretation fits better here, given the previous sutras. And Madhva is saying, and it can be known, right? So, okay, the scriptures are consistent, right? There is Brahman, it's the source of creation. It can be known from scripture. The scriptures are consistent, and it can be known. So for him, for Adams, that seems to flow much better than the Shankara and Ramanuja version, which is all of a sudden they start debating Sankhya randomly here, and then they go back to talking about Brahman again, especially given that they are going to formally and officially, Badarayana is more clearly going to be rejecting Sankhya later on at the end of this chapter, the beginning of the next chapter. So there we have it. That's all we're going to do for the Vedanta Sutra. Okay, this is an exegetical tradition. Upanishads are sacred, and they teach about Atman and Brahman. And so yoga next week is going to be about how do we experience it, what are the methods. Okay, we know about it. Yoga is going to accept the Upanishadic teachings and say, fine, we've been taught about it in the Upanishads. We know that the goal of life is to seek it now. And it can be known now, not sort of after death, post-mortem, but it can be known in this life. So how is it are there methods through which we can know this Atman, this Purusha? And Yoga Sutra is going to be about the methods of meditation. It's going to be more psychology, actually, the nature of the mind and how to get beyond the mind. Okay, so an understanding of the mind, not just psychology for the sake of psychology, but to get beyond it. The goal of these traditions is liberation. This is what makes it quite different from Western philosophy, at least modern Western philosophy. Okay, so then next week we have the praxis. Praxis is an academic term which basically means practice. And then we'll do the Nyaya Sutra later on in the semester, which will be about arguing for the Atman and other such things using reason and arguments. So Nyaya is going to be the closest thing we get to actual philosophy as understood in the West. Okay, so therefore we have these three great traditions. One is exegesis, how to interpret sacred texts consistently. Vedanta, we barely touched upon it. We just had a little glance at the first 5 sutras. The second is, okay, then how, what are the methods through which we can experience truth, not just theorize about it, not just abstract analysis about it, but can it be experienced? And that's the Yoga Sutras. And then then the week after that will be reason and argument. So we haven't done much Mimamsa. I originally planned to put Mimamsa Sutra, first 4 verses into the course, but we just couldn't fit them all in. I probably will add it after the course is over, just so that I have a complete course. So if anyone's interested in studying the first 4 sutras of the Mimamsa Sutras, and also the Vaisheshika Sutras, I originally had them on, if you look at the first syllabus, they had both of those, but it was just, the lectures were ending up being longer than I had anticipated, so we had to cut those. But I plan anyway, to add them over the Christmas break after the course is finished. So if anyone is interested, you can get in touch with me then, and I'll probably upload them into Sakai or somewhere, and then you can access them. Also, if you're interested in the Vedanta Sutra, and if these 4 verses have whetted your appetite, we did the whole course on the Vedanta Sutra last semester. And because of COVID, we were in the classroom for the first half of the semester up until spring break. Spring break is when everything imploded. So we read the entire Upanishads, and the first chapter of the Vedanta Sutra, we read that in class, but then the last 3 chapters were all online. They've all been recorded. And then I went back and added and actually re-recorded some of the first chapter. So if you're interested in more lectures on the Vedanta Sutra, just send me an email and I'll put your name in Sakai from last semester, and you'll be able to go in, and there's a whole bunch of lectures. So there might be 1 or 2 of you, or a few of you, that would like to have more Vedanta. Okay, so hopefully we're clear then. So we have basically 3 problems, if you want to call them problems. You have the Upanishads, which, we read, and some obscure parts, of course, but basically they're unsystematic. You don't get a systematic worldview or spirit, or metaphysics from the Upanishads. So therefore, Badarayana comes along and he writes his sutras, and we've just read 4 or 5 of them. You see how succinct they are. So Badarayana in his mind is clarifying, systematizing, right? Verse number 4, Samanvayat, they're consistent. Sutra number 4, Tattu Samanvayat, in his mind they are consistent. So the whole Badarayana sees himself as systematizing the Upanishads. So the problem with the Upanishads, they appear to be unsystematic. Remember, a traditional thinker would never say they are systematic. An academic scholar would say that, but not a traditional Vedantic. So they're unsystematic. Badarayana comes along, systematizes them. Now he creates a new problem. What's that? The sutras are so succinct, we don't know what they're referring to. We've just had an excellent example, right, of one sutra, verse sutra number 5, very important one. And Shankara and Ramanuja understand it completely different from Madhva. So they interpret it differently. And then Shankara's entire metaphysics, that the world is false, it's a mirage, and the Atman is also false. When it merges in Brahman, it loses its individuality. It's not false, but its individuality is false. That's he construes that teaching from the Upanishads, where Ramanuja, world is real, souls are eternally individual, and Brahman is the person. So the commentaries, so Badarayana is so succinct. We have to interpret what he's saying. So that means a second tier of interpretation, the commentaries, and now they create a third problem. And what's the third problem? They completely differ from each other. This is the Vedanta tradition, and those differences have been handed down in lineages to this very day. So the Advaita tradition has its base in Sringeri in South India. The Ramanuja tradition, Madhva, is in Udupi, also in South India, not so far. In fact, but wonderful places to visit if you get a chance. And the Ramanuja tradition has various strongholds. And this is Vedanta to this day. These differences, and the most recent commentary was written just a few years ago from the Swaminarayan tradition. But Dresh Swami, in fact, he came to my house and gave me a copy. So that would be that's a tradition, that's a commentary based on the teachings of Swami Narayana, who was during the British Raj, so quite recent. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time. So there's three types of problems in the Vedanta tradition, and then we'll finish. The Upanishads, if I'm using the word problem, let's change that. Let's say challenges. There's three challenges, because I don't want to, I want to respect the tradition. The tradition wouldn't see this as a problem. Let's call them challenges. I think everybody would agree with that. Challenge of the Upanishads is they appear unsystematic. It's a challenge. Okay, Badarayana comes along in order to systematize them. And now he creates a new challenge. His sutras give us a new challenge that's so succinct. We don't even know which verse they refer to. They need to be interpreted in turn. So that's the challenge of the Vedanta Sutras. Succinct, we don't know what the sutras actually mean or refer to. We need to be told by the commentators. So now we have the third tier, right? Upanishads, first tier, Vedanta Sutras written to systematize them, so they're second tier. Now the third tier are the commentaries on the Vedanta Sutra, as well sometimes also the same commentators, Shankara, he wrote both the commentaries on the Upanishads and the Vedanta Sutra. But now the commentaries create a different kind of challenge for us, the reader. And what is that? They interpret these, both the Vedanta Sutra and the Upanishads, not just slightly differently, completely and utterly different. How much difference do you want? Right? Ramanuja, there is a God, world is real, the souls are eternal individuals. Shankara, world is false, the individuality of the soul is false, and there's only Brahman, and Brahman is impersonal, not a personal deity. I mean, those you can hardly conceive of bigger differences than that. And these positions are all based on readings of the Vedanta Sutra and the Upanishads by these different commentators. So that's why we can't speak about Vedanta. We have to speak about one of the traditions within Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta, Shankara, Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, Ramanuja, right? Qualified non-dualism. We had that in the last lecture. Shankara's Advaita, no dualism at all. Ramanuja, Vishishta Advaita, okay, it's all Brahman, but Vishishta, there's differences, there's real differences, and they're eternal differences. Brahman is world, Brahman is the soul. Madhva, radical Dvaita, not Advaita, Dvaita, dualism. God is eternally distinct from the souls, God is eternally distinct from matter, one soul is eternally distinct from another soul, and the ultimate anus, matter consists of these anus. Remember, I had a lot of discussion about anus, these irreducible entities that differ from each other. So therefore the lineages continue, and people situate themselves in these lineages. Nowadays, Neo-Advaita has become very popular since the nationalist period, and sort of that's the Advaita that's been exported to the West. So we're more likely to encounter what scholars call Neo-Advaita. It's not really classical Shankara, but sort of a form of Shankara that's absorbed various bits and pieces. And you're most likely to encounter that in an East-West bookstore, or it tends to get much more representation than the theistic Vedantins, for reasons that are historical, nothing to do with with how significant these traditions are on the ground. Okay, so again, anybody interested in a full course in Vedanta, drop me an email.